G'day church. Well, yes, I'm preaching from my lounge room, not because this message was originally preached here. I did preach it last week at the Whittlesea Secondary College where we normally meet, but there was a glitch with our camera and only got the first 7 minutes of the message. So I'm preaching again to you today from my lounge room. It's reminding me very much of the COVID days. Oh, do we want to go back there? The COVID days when my lounge room was set up as almost a permanent studio. I had my family sitting in one corner and the dog in the other. Yes, I don't want to go back to those times. But yes, anyway, today, this is what you're getting. As part of our Moments That Matter series, we're jumping actually way ahead. Last week, I talked about Joshua leading the Israelites into the Promised Land. Today, we're jumping way ahead in our series through the Old Testament, looking at David and Goliath. Now, part of it is there's a whole lot of great stories that we've missed in the process. We've missed, great characters like Gideon and Samson and Delilah and a whole lot of others. But part of this series is what we're trying to achieve is looking at how the Old Testament looks forward into the New. So today we're jumping forward, as I said, to David and Goliath, which is probably one of the most famous and most loved Old Testament or love stories of all time. It's often, however, reduced to being a kid's story. And the problem with that is that we've simplified it so much that we only see it as this kind of, great story of the underdog who takes on, the world, or this champion, this big guy, Goliath. But there's actually so much more to this story. There's actually layers upon layers to this story of meaning. And so today I want to try and unpack some of that as much as I can. When I was reading through in preparation for this message, 1 Samuel 17, which is where you find the story, I was reminded of another famous battle. Now, often when we think of Australia's involvement in World War I, the first thing that comes to mind is Gallipoli, which was at the beginning of the war. However, there was another famous battle near the end of World War I that involved Australian soldiers. There was plenty of battles where Australians did remarkable things, but particularly at the end of the war. And it was the Battle of Beersheba. Now, in 1917, British-led forces tried taking the town of Beersheba, now modern-day Israel, from the Ottoman and German control, but had failed twice because the town formed actually part of a major defensive line. And for them, it was actually a strategic, in order to take that town and to actually able to push forward, it was actually a strategic town from a lot of ways, not just from a military perspective of actually breaking the defence line, but also the town had a whole lot of wells, which was actually important. If you think about it, you've got a whole military, a whole army behind you. You need water in the desert. You need water, and they had the wells that they needed to seize in Beersheba. Now, in that year, the British-led forces had tried twice to take the town, but had actually failed. And then in October, they tried once again. And after a long day of fighting, some progress was made in the defence lines. However, the town still remained in enemy hands. The problem was that if they didn't take the town quickly, the advancing army risked losing access to the water wells. As I said, the water was really important. The Germans were willing that it's like, if we don't get it, if we can't keep it, then you're not going to get it either, and we're going to make you suffer. So they're willing to blow up the wells. If the town was going to be taken, they're going to be willing to take to blow up the wells, leaving the Allies kind of desperate. At this stage, they're getting quite desperate. So after a long day of fighting, the Allies are unable to push through and to take the town. The British-led forces, led by British command, employing their traditional military kind of tactics in order to, push through. But it just wasn't working. Nothing was working. But they hadn't considered the Australians. Now, at this stage, by the end of a long day of fighting, there was this desperation. It was like, this is a hopeless situation. We're never going to get this town. As I said, the Australians came up with a different kind of perspective. You know, they had underestimated the Australian Light Horse Brigade. Now, the Australian Light Horse Brigade were actually mounted troops who normally rode into battle, dismounted, and then fought on foot. So, you know, you go up on your horse, you ride in, dismount, you got your rifle with your bayonet, and you'd march in to fight. Unlike the cavalry, who would come in on horses and go all the way through with swords. So, knowing that, so the Australians decided they were going to have a go at it. With 800, I think about 800 soldiers, they rode in. Now, the Turkish, under German command, knew that they were the Australian light horse, and they knew how they fought battles. You know, there's a way in which you do things. And the British had, up until this point, was pretty well, did things exactly according to the book. And so they set their artillery to a particular distance to where they knew or estimated where the Australians were going to dismount and then start marching in. And so they set their artillery. And the Australian soldiers, on their horses, started riding in. And as they got to the point where the artillery was actually set, instead of slowing down, dismounting, they continued to pick up pace and rode all the way through to the town. And with the Germans panicking, they started firing the artillery, but it went over their heads and missed them. And the Australians ended up taking the town in what's now regarded as quite an amazing battle. You know, taking the Turkish totally by surprise. Capturing the town and its wells before they were exploded. Now, in a similar way, 1 Samuel 17 describes what looks like an impossible situation. Like the Allied forces facing a heavily fortified opposition at Beersheba, the Israelites appeared to have no realistic path to victory against the Philistines, who were well-equipped, battle-hardened, and superior as far as their weaponry and technology. And let's not forget their hidden weapon. Their hidden weapon, a huge giant who embodied everything Israel seemed to lack. You know, strength and confidence. From a human perspective, it was an unfair battle. And yet there was something the Philistines did not take into consideration. Something that the Israelites should have themselves taken into consideration but overlooked themselves, and that was the God of Israel. I'm going to try and cover the whole of 1 Samuel 17 today, but because of its length, I'm going to summarise most of it. By way of some background, we need to put things in perspective. God had recently rejected King Saul of Israel because of his continual refusal to follow God's commands. So in response, God sent the prophet Samuel to Bethlehem to anoint a new king from the house of Jesse. Whilst Jesse's oldest sons appeared on the outside to be, you know, big, strong, very impressive young fellas, God instead chose the youngest son, David, a shepherd boy. The Bible says in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel that at his anointing, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in a very powerful way. Jump ahead a little and we reach chapter 17 and we got this story. It starts off with the Philistines and their forces setting themselves up for war. They set themselves up on a hill on which the Israelites respond, and they come out to defend themselves, and they set themselves up on another hill. So you Philistines on one hill, Israelites on another hill, a valley in between. And this is where the story of David and Goliath takes place, in this valley, where there's actually this standoff that's going on at the time. So I'm going to start from 1 Samuel 17, 4 to 11. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall and had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armour, a bronze weighing, I've given you the modern day calculation, of about 58 kilograms. That's pretty heavy. On his legs he wore bronze greaves and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod and his iron point weighed about 6.9 kilograms. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. This taunting went on for 40 days in which no fighting occurred. And whilst David's oldest brothers were serving in Saul's army, David was looking after his father's sheep. But out of concern for his older brothers, Jesse, their father, decided to send David out to check up on his oldest sons and to bring supplies with them. And it was at this particular time when David arrived, when the Israelite army were preparing for battle, and he overheard Goliath issuing his daily challenge. And seeing how terrified the Israelite soldiers were of him, David questioned them, why would they allow this Philistine to defy the armies of the living God? And despite being criticised by his older brother for sticking his nose into probably, because it's men's business. What are you? You're just a little boy. Did you just come here to stick your nose into things? Just go home. Despite that, David continued asking questions in which his words eventually reached the ears of King Saul, who sent for him. And we pick up the story in verse 32. It says, David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go out and fight this Philistine. You are only a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by the hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Why Saul allows David to go, not quite sure. Maybe he's desperate at this point, or maybe he actually truly believes that it's actually possible. Anyway, it goes on, it says, "And then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armour on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around with it because he was not used to walking with it. And he says, I cannot go with these. So he took them off, and he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, and put them in a pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. As Goliath approached, he saw David and despised him. He mocked him for being only a boy. He cursed David by his gods and threatened to kill him and to give his body to the birds and the wild animals. I think he's got a few anger issues. And we pick up in verse 45. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with a sword and a spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by the sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead, and the Philistine fell face down on the ground. David finishes off Goliath by killing him and chopping off his head with Goliath's own sword. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they all fled, and the Israelites pursued them, winning a decisive victory. Because it can be so easy, as I've already said, to get caught up in this story. I want to do something a little bit different and break it down, so we don't miss what's really going on beneath the surface. And that is that within this text there are numerous comparisons that are actually going on, such as the visual contrast between strong and the weak. We already saw this at the very beginning. We've got the Israelites on one side, on one hill, and the Philistines on the other. The Israel are feeling fearful, powerless, and discouraged, whereas on the other side, the Philistines are confident, powerful, and arrogant. And we can see this comparison up on the screen. Now, I'm not going to get into any real detail amongst this. I'll just quickly go through it. But, we see with the Philistine army, this comparison going on here. We've got, led by their champion Goliath, who is confident and arrogant. The army is categorized by their confidence in military strength and weaponry. Goliath issues daily taunts and challenges for 40 days. They rely on intimidation and conventional warfare. They're strong, they're dominant in appearance and powerful, and initially confident and unchallenged. Where the Israelites, led by King Saul, are fearful and hesitant. The army is categorized by fear. King Saul refuses to respond to Goliath's taunts for 40 days. He's too afraid for single combat, overwhelmed by the situation, and remains paralyzed until David, a young shepherd boy, acts. The irony in all this is that it should have been the complete opposite story. It should have been Israel who should have been the confident ones. Isn't it Israel who are the ones who God rescues from Egypt, and who they see God deliver them through the Red Sea, and even across the Jordan River, and to conquer the lands, the promised land. God had been fighting for them, delivering their armies against sometimes their enemies, against sometimes overwhelming odds. Yet, instead, they remain paralyzed in fear. Eventually, they overcome their fear and win a decisive battle, but only after a young boy, for goodness sake, a shepherd boy. And it's only then, when they see his faith in God, that they decided to move forward and act themselves. Interesting, the same contrast between strong and weak is also reflected in the characters of David and Goliath themselves. From a worldly perspective, Goliath appears to be this strong, invincible character. He's a Philistine warrior, physically imposing, towering stature, overwhelming in presence, heavily armoured, representing military power and technology, represents fear, strength and outward appearance, trusts in physical power and mocks Israel and the God of Israel, moves forward in arrogance and contempt. Whereas you got David, from a worldly perspective, is actually seen to be probably quite weak. He's a shepherd boy, youthful, small, unimpressive in appearance, and not intimidating at all. Rejects King Saul's armour, carries only a staff, sling and 5 stones, represents faith, humility and reliance on God rather than appearance, trusts in God and sees the battle as a spiritual battle, not just a military battle, moves forward in faith and conviction, believing that the battle belongs to the Lord. So what does this teach us? Well, number one, the secret of true strength. Have you ever noticed how most of the male superheroes are portrayed? They're usually, tall and muscular and powerful, physically imposing, broad shoulders, bulging muscles, a six-pack to die for. That's often how the world defines strength. Strength is seen as power, size, influence, status, ability, one's self-confidence. The stronger, the bigger, the more capable, the better. Maybe that's why I like Spider-Man as a superhero, because he's just a kid. Before the battle had even begun, everyone watching would have assumed David had no chance of winning whatsoever. For Goliath was stronger, larger, more experienced in battle, and better equipped to fight. Everything they understood about warfare told them that David was outmatched and outclassed. But whilst the world may perceive strength to look like Goliath, God has a totally different perspective. Now, when selecting David to be the next king of Israel, God told Samuel this. It says in 1 Samuel 1:16-7, "The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outside appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." God is not concerned about outward appearances, but rather he's more interested in a person's inner character. And more importantly, true strength doesn't come from what we possess. It comes from who we trust. Where do you usually look for strength when facing a challenge? And what Goliaths in your life make you feel inadequate or weak or outmatched? Philippians 4:12-13 says, "I have learnt the secret of being confident in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. We can do this through him who gives us" what? Strength. Number 2, we need to focus on God's faithfulness. When David learns about Goliath, he doesn't respond with fear like the rest of Israel. Whilst King Saul and his army are focused on the size of the giant, David is instead focused on God's greatness. Speaking to King Saul, David says, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion, the paw of the bear, will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." David's faith is shaped by his memory of God's past faithfulness, which give him the confidence to step out into the challenge that lay ahead of him. This despite the lack of encouragement from his brother and even Saul. So tell me, when a difficult challenge comes your way, what is your first reaction? Do you immediately focus on the problem? Or when bad news arrives, does your mind quickly jump to the worst case scenario? Now, I'm a bit of a half glass empty person sometimes, and so, I get it, I understand. For many of us, this is a natural response. We can easily become consumed by the size of the challenge in front of us. Our thoughts begin racing through everything that could go wrong. And we wonder whether we have the strength, the resources or ability to get through what lies ahead. Whether that be a health diagnosis, financial pressure, a breakdown in relationship, uncertainty about a future, or an unexpected setback, we can easily become overwhelmed by the problem. Like Israel, we can become consumed by the size of the challenge that we lose sight of God altogether. But perhaps we should practice being a little bit more like David. Instead of focusing on the giant standing in front of us, we need to focus on God and his faithfulness, remembering all the times when he has rescued us, the times when he has carried us, the times when he has provided for us. Don't let the size of our problem define our perspective. Let the faithfulness of God define our response. So I'll say that again. Don't let the size of our problem define our perspective. Let the faithfulness of God define our response. Thirdly, we need to consider what motivates us. What motivates us? Terrified by the seemingly unbeatable giant, King Saul offers a reward to any man who will kill or defeat the Philistine. It says in 1 Samuel 17, 25 to 26. Now the Israelites had begun saying, "The king will give great wealth to the man who kills the giant. He will also give him his daughter in marriage, and his whole family will be exempt from taxes in Israel." David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Unable or perhaps unwilling to face the giant himself, Saul promises great wealth, marriage into the royal family, and even exemption from taxes. There you go, there's a way to get exempt from your taxes. Kill a giant. This would make whoever kills Goliath one of the most powerful and influential men in the whole of Israel. Yet, David saw the situation very differently. Whilst those who weren't already scared, focused on the reward, David instead focused on the disgrace. In his eyes, Goliath was not simply threatening Israel, he was mocking God. He was mocking God's people and defying God. David's primary concern was not the wealth, status, or approval that he might gain, the recognition he might receive. Rather, he was driven by a desire to defend the honour of God and to remove the shame that had fallen upon Israel. There are many people within our churches, or within churches, not our church, of course, who are willing to serve or give or to lead in some way or another if there is something to be gained. It's about what they can get out of it, out of the opportunity, as opposed to what they can contribute. So what motivates your decisions and actions? When God's glory becomes our primary concern, our perspective changes. Because we become less focused on what we stand to lose or gain, and we become instead more focused on being faithful to Him. 1 Corinthians 10:31 says, "Whether we eat or drink or whatever we do, do it all for the glory of God." If you want to know what your purpose in life is, you want to know what you're here for as a Christian, it is actually to glorify God. It's as simple as that. Nothing more, simply to glorify God. Do you do things to glorify God with your life in response to all that He's done for you? Or do you do things because you're seeking fame or reward or position or whatever it might be? What motivates you to do what you do as a believer? Finally, faith in God brings courage. Faith in God brings courage. After permitting David to fight Goliath, King Saul attempts to dress him in his armour, which from a human standpoint makes perfectly a lot of sense. If you're going to fight a giant, you want to be protected, right? And you want to have the right weapons in order to do so. But David rejects them. They may look impressive. They may make him look like a warrior, like he's capable of doing what everyone expecting him to do. But they weren't what David had put his trust in. Instead, he took what God had already placed in his hands and what he had learned to use: a sling, a few stones, and his faith. Now, from Goliath's perspective, it would have actually been quite insulting. He wanted to prove himself. I am a giant. I am the best. I'm the most ruthless warrior out there. Send out a man, one of your best men that you have in your whole army, the best man, and come out and fight me, and I'll show you just how good I am by defeating him. And then I'll make you all my slaves, my servants. He's got something to prove. I find it really interesting that within this story, we don't see the king of the Philistines anywhere. It's actually David. It's actually the Goliath. So Goliath is out there making these taunts. We hear nothing of their king. He's taken or assumed this role because he's, I think, arrogant and proud, and as I said, he's got something to prove. So it would have been quite insulting for this little shepherd boy to come out and confront him. We're reading 1 Samuel 17, 42 to 44. It says, "He looked at David and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, 'Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?' And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. 'Come here,' he said, 'and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals.'" Yet despite these threats and this mocking, David did not look back. Instead, he replied, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of God, the living God, the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." David's courage did not come from Saul's armour or weapons or military experience. His courage came from knowing that God was with him, within him, and from faithfully using that which God had already placed in his hands, what he knew what to use, what he knew what to do, because he had years of experience using them, those tools. So where does your courage come from? Are you confident enough to know that God is able to use you and whatever gifts you may have to defeat your giants? In David's case, he does not pretend that the giant is small. Rather, he simply knows that God is bigger. Do we know that? We've talked about challenges already. The challenges in our life. They can be overwhelming. And we can have the fear, like the Israelites, and discouragement to go, "Oh, what am I going to do? How am I going to overcome this? How am I going to pay my debts? How are we going to do this? I've got this person, these problems here. What am I going to do?" Faith in God gives us courage, because in the big scheme of things, when we look up, our problems become very small. Now, as I mentioned at the start, the story of 1 Samuel 17 is actually a story of comparisons with lots and lots of layers. And like many of the Old Testament passages that we've looked at recently, the story of David and Goliath points to another reality, which is only fully understood and appreciated through the lens of Jesus and the cross, in which symbolically Goliath is more than just a giant, he's more than just a warrior, he's a symbol of everything that opposes God and his people, everything that opposes God and us as believers. Now, I've got another comparison here, and I'm not going to go through them all, but you can see already that, if you look through the story here and what it says about Goliath, and then you compare that with Satan, we see some similarities happening here. Interesting, the one that stands out most for me is actually interesting is, Goliath is described as having a scale armour. And in the Hebrew, it actually emphasises this even further. Basically, from helmet, all the way down to his feet, head to foot, he looked like a giant serpent, in effect. And what does that remind us of? Eden, where the serpent deceived Adam and Eve, or God's people. So you can see the comparison going on there. Just as Goliath stands before Israel as a seemingly unbeatable enemy, Satan stands before humanity as our enemy. But Goliath's downfall, particularly through a wound to his head, foreshadows God's ultimate victory over the serpent through Jesus Christ, the true and greater David. And once again, one more comparison I'd like to give you about, you can see here, between David and Jesus. So if we were to compare David and compare Jesus, once again, you'll see some remarkable comparisons in this story. Through its imagery and symbolism, the story of David and Goliath is so much more than just a story of how a shepherd boy defeated a giant. From a bigger perspective, it points to the hope we have in Jesus, who stood against our greatest enemy and defeated him on the cross on our behalf. Conquering sin and death and the powers of darkness that oppose God and all believers, yet the story also provides us with an example to follow. Now, many of us heard the acronym WWJD. What does it mean? What would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? It was very popular when I was much younger. People would have their little bracelets and whatever and have WWJD on it. And for some people, they might find that very difficult to follow because after all, Jesus, he was perfect. What would Jesus do? Oh, that's all very nice and well and good, but he's perfect. I want us to consider this. What about David? He was an ordinary person just like you and me, who later in life actually made some really bad life choices and decisions. He made some stuff-ups, big stuff-ups. Yet the Bible describes him as being a man after God's heart, and we'll unpack that a little bit further next week, who with the power of the Holy Spirit was able to accomplish some amazing things for God. In the young David, we have an example to follow. Someone who focused on God's faithfulness, who was motivated to bring about God's glory, whose faith gave him courage, and whose early life pointed to the perfecter of our faith, Jesus Christ. I suppose my point is, if David can do it, then you can do it too. WWJD, maybe we should have WWDD? What would David do? No. But my point is that if David can actually achieve these things, then we can too. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to stuff up. But it's about stepping out in faith and not allowing ourselves to be conquered or debilitated by our fear. Not to be debilitated by our fear. Focusing on God's past faithfulness and how he's provided for us and continues to provide for us. And not worrying about the future because we can look at the past and see how he's provided in so many different ways. Yeah? Motivated by wanting to actually bring about God's glory in our life. Not about ourselves. Not looking inward, but looking outward. Who in faith, when we start trusting in God, then we actually have the courage to be able to step out and do what he's actually called us to do. Ultimately, we too then can point to Jesus. Just like David in his life, as an example, as a young boy, pointed towards the greater reality of Jesus. In our lives, as part of what it means to glorify God, is to point to Jesus in all that we do, in all that we say, and all that we think. I hope that's that's been challenging for you this morning. As I said, there's so much more that we could talk about with the story of David and Goliath. There are actually other layers to unpack in there as well that even point towards end times, but we're not even going to go there today. But it's actually, I just hope you understand, it's not a story that, please don't underestimate this story. Please don't, compartmentalize it as being this little kid story that, it's all, as I said, it's about the underdog. It's not. It's actually so much more than that. It's an awesome story, and I encourage you all to go back and read over that chapter 17 in 1 Samuel for yourselves and see what God actually speaks to you through that passage. God bless.
Remember, if ever you miss one of our messages or services, you can always catch up by going to our website. There's a link there to our YouTube channel, and there you'll find all our recent messages, which will also include church news.
Upcoming services.